The toolbox was the last thing I opened. 3 days clearing out my father's rented room above a laundromat in Boston, and I had almost left it for last because I thought I already knew what was inside. Lyle Holloway had worked maintenance at a paper mill in Berlin, New Hampshire for 28 years before the layoffs brought him south. Tools made sense. Tools were the one language I had ever seen him speak with any confidence. I lifted the latch. The hammer was there, the sockets in their plastic tray, the screwdrivers gone glossy from 40 years of his hands. I lifted out the tray to set it aside, and that was when I noticed the bottom was wrong. It sat 2 inches higher than the outside of the box should have allowed. My fingernail found the seam. The false bottom came up in a single piece hinged at the back, and inside that narrow, hidden space lay 2 things. A folded paper, soft as cloth, with 4 words in my father's careful block print, for Marin, when ready, and a skeleton on a leather hoard, harnessed to the color of dried blood. He had known he was going to die. He had prepared for it. And this, a key and a note hidden under a false bottom in a maintenance man's toolbox, was what he had chosen to leave me. I did not yet know that one stone farmhouse in the White Mountains of New Hampshire had been waiting 92 years for that key. I did not yet know what was sealed beneath its kitchen floor, or what 7 families in a county I had never visited had lost in 1932 and never recovered. I did not yet know that the silence of my father's life had a shape, and that shape was about to open. My father and I had not been close. I want to be honest about that, because the rest of this story only makes sense if you understand the shape of the silence between us. It was not hostility. It was not cruelty. It was a particular kind of quiet that filled every room he occupied, the way cold settles into a house with no fire in it. Lyle Holloway was a man who showed up. He worked. He paid the rent. He came to my high school graduation in a button-down shirt that still smelled faintly of machine oil, even though he had pressed it the night before. He never raised his hand. He never raised his voice. But he never spoke about things that mattered. Not about where he came from, not about his family, not about why his eyes went somewhere far away whenever a conversation drifted even close to his own history. I grew up knowing almost nothing about the Holloway side. My mother left when I was 3, moved to Arizona with a man she had met at a trade convention, and by the time I was old enough to wonder about my roots, the only soil I could find was my father's silence. He had one sister, Beatrice, who lived 2 hours south in Lowell and called twice a year with the studied warmth of someone performing an obligation she did not quite remember the reason for. I had no grandparents I could remember. I had a father who worked 12-hour shifts at the Berlin paper mill until the layoffs in 2019, then drove down to Boston and took a maintenance job at a building on Commonwealth Avenue and came home every night smelling of solvent and steam, and never once talked about what came before him. He died on a Tuesday in late March, a heart attack in the basement utility room of the building he maintained between the boiler and the breaker panel. The day porter found him sitting against the wall with a wrench still in his hand. By the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing to be done. He was 62 years old. I was 22. I had been living with my college friend Dorel in her one-bedroom apartment in Alston for 6 months, sleeping on a fold-out futon, working 3 shifts a week at a wine bar near Brookline that was rumored to be closing. I had $312 in my checking account and a student loan bill I had stopped opening. I was not in any position to grieve elegantly. The funeral was small. 11 people from the building stood in their good jackets in a chapel on the edge of Roxbury and looked at their shoes while a pastor said the kinds of things pastors say when they have not known the deceased long. My Aunt Beatrice arrived 10 minutes late and cried in a way that was mostly about Beatrice. She hugged me once briefly, her perfume sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. Her son, Holden, my cousin, stood by the door scrolling his phone and did not look up when the pastor read the closing prayer. In the parking lot afterward, Beatrice found me before I reached Dorel's car. "He didn't have a will, Marin." "I know. I checked with the probate office in Suffolk County. Already made the call this morning." "That was fast." She smiled with her mouth, but not with her eyes. "His personal property goes to next of kin. You technically." A pause. "But I helped raise Lyle's sweetheart. I was his older sister, and I did things for that man that deserve some recognition. He didn't have much, but he had savings. He always saved, even on what they paid him. I know he did." "Aunt Beatrice." "He would have wanted his family looked after is all I'm saying." I kept my voice level. "If I find anything, I'll let you know." The smile thinned. "You do that." Holden was leaning against her car by then, finally looking up, his phone tucked under his arm. He said loud enough to carry, "Don't hold your breath, Mom. She probably already spent it on her little life in the city." I did not respond. I walked to Dorel's car, and we drove the 4 miles back to Alston in silence. And that night, I lay on the futon listening to a siren 2 streets over, and tried to understand how it was possible to grieve someone you had never quite been allowed to know. The letter from the county arrived 8 days later. It came to Dorel's address because I had listed it as my father's emergency contact 2 years ago and never updated anything. The envelope was thick, and the return address was a place I had never heard of. Office of Property and Records, Coos County, New Hampshire. Inside was a 1-page notice from a woman named Lenora Whitlock, county property attorney. My father had held title to a parcel of land on Hemlock Ridge Road, 11 acres, including an unoccupied stone structure of indeterminate condition. Upon his death, title transferred automatically to his sole heir. Me. I called that evening. Miss Whitlock's voice was professional and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had explained the same procedures a great many times. "Your father paid the property taxes every year without fail," she said, going back to 2004 when he inherited the parcel from his own father, Royce Holloway, who died that same year. The assessor did a drive-by 6 years ago. The structure is still standing. Beyond that, no one has been out there in a long time. Has anyone expressed interest in buying it? A brief pause on the line. A man named Maxwell Vance. He runs a holding company up here, Vance Mountain Holdings. His most recent offer to your father was $9,000. He turned it down. He turned them all down. Every year for 22 years. The Vance Company made an offer every spring like clockwork. Your father never even responded. The county forwarded the letters, and then we just stopped because your father had asked us to. Why would he turn that down? She was quiet for a moment longer than the question required. I couldn't say, Miss Holloway. He was a private man. He paid on time. That's everything I knew about him until last week. I thanked her and hung up. I sat on the futon with the skeleton key in my palm and the county notice on my lap, and I tried to fit the pieces together. He had owned land. He had paid taxes on it for 22 years without saying a word to me. He had turned down money for it every year without ever explaining why. And he had left me a key with 4 words written above it in his careful block print. When ready. Ready for what? The next morning, I told Dorel I was driving to Coos County. She looked at me over her coffee cup. For what exactly? To see it. She set the mug down. Honey, you have $40 in your wallet and $300 in the bank. That is not a budget. That is a list of reasons to stay home. He left me a key, Dorel. He left you a key to a building in the middle of nowhere in a county nobody from Boston has ever been to, in a state where it still snows in May. Your father just died. You don't need to be driving north chasing some property notice. You need to eat a meal and sleep 8 hours and call the bank about the loan. It's not nowhere. It's Coos County. That is genuinely the same thing. I called Beatrice that afternoon out of some obligation I still cannot fully explain. I told her about the land. The silence on the other end of the line was short and dense. He owned land, she said slowly, in New Hampshire for 22 years. And not one word. That's what the county attorney said. Marin, her voice had gone careful, a hairline crack running through the control. I need to know what is on that property. I don't know yet. I'll come with you. You don't need to do that. I know I don't need to. The careful voice was sharpening now the way frost sharpens a fence rail. But whatever is on that land belonged to the Holloway family long before your father got his hands on it. Long before he decided to leave it to a 22-year-old girl who doesn't know the first thing about property. This isn't solely your business. The title transferred directly to me. That's what the county said. In the background, Holden's voice came through, not quite muffled. Let her go up there. She'll see it's a pile of rotten boards in a ditch and come crawling back. I ended the call. The next morning, I loaded my duffel bag into the back of Dorel's old Subaru, which she lent me with strict instructions to have it back by Sunday, and drove north out of Boston. I crossed the New Hampshire line in light rain, and the rain followed me for most of an hour, and then thinned into a high gray sky that hung above the trees like a sheet of pulled cotton. The landscape changed as I drove. The crowded suburbs gave way to rolling farm country. The farms gave way to ridges, and the ridges folded upward into mountains. Through Concord, then Plymouth, then north, on a 2-lane road that wound between hills the color of damp slate. The towns got smaller. The gas stations got farther apart. By the time I crossed into Coos County, the trees had closed in tight along the highway, hemlock and spruce and the bare gray fingers of birch, not yet leafed out for spring. Snow still sat in the shadowed pockets between the trees. April in the White Mountains is not the April of Boston. April here is the long memory of winter reluctant to leave. Wexler Falls was barely a town. A green metal bridge over a fast, clear river. A general store with hand-lettered signs in the window. A diner called Pell's with a neon open sign buzzing in the lower right pane of glass. A post office. A hardware store. A small white town hall with a flagpole and a cannon from a war so old no one in the photograph beside it was still alive. Main Street stretched maybe 3 blocks in either direction, and then it was County Road again. I parked beside the town hall and found Lenora Whitlock's office on the 2nd floor, accessible by a wooden exterior staircase that creaked under my boots. She was younger than her phone voice had suggested. Late 30s, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, a desk buried in stacked manila folders. She shook my hand, confirmed everything she had told me over the phone, then added one thing she had not. "Your great-grandfather built the house," she said. "Thaddeus Holloway. He came into Coos County in 1920, purchased the parcel outright in cash, and built the stone farmhouse over the next 2 years. The county records start in 1922. He lived there until his death in 1956. And then it went to my grandfather, Royce." Royce Holloway, yes. Though according to the assessor's notes from that period, Royce never lived on the property. He held the title but stayed away from it. She opened a folder, ran her finger down a page. There are some old notes that mention a dispute between Thaddeus and Royce in the mid-1930s. Nothing formal, just references to a conversation in which Thaddeus stated he intended to keep the property clear of his son's affairs. She closed the folder. "I don't know what that means." I pressed my fingers against the skeleton key in my jacket pocket and felt the weight of it. "Can I drive out today?" "Of course. It's yours." She wrote out directions on an index card in neat blue ink. "There's a man named Hollister Crane who runs the hardware store on Main. His family has been in this county 4 generations. He knew your great-grandfather, or knew of him well enough. Might be worth a conversation before you head out." I thanked her and walked back down the creaking stairs into the cold April air. Hollister Crane was in his mid-70s, broad through the chest, with a face that had been shaped by decades of outdoor work, and what appeared to be a lifetime of honest opinions held without apology. The hardware store smelled of machine oil and cedar shavings, and the faint sweetness of the wood stove burning at the back of the shop. He was reorganizing a rack of drill bits when I came through the door, and he looked up at me with the particular attention of a man in a small town who notices new faces and files them carefully against everything he already knows. I told him who I was. He was still for a long moment. Then he set down the drill bit and leaned an elbow on the counter. Lyle Holloway's daughter. Yes. You knew of him. He came up here once, 2008, I believe it was. Drove out to the property, came back into town that same evening. Stopped in here for a soda and a road map. Stayed about 10 minutes. He had your eyes. He paused. Paid his taxes every year like clockwork. That much people in this county knew. Beyond that, he was a name on a county ledger. Do you know anything about Thaddeus, my great-grandfather? Hollister picked the drill bit back up and turned it slowly in his fingers, a thinking motion. Thaddeus Holloway was a serious man, hard worker, kept to himself, but known for being fair. People in this county respected him, even when they didn't see him often. A pause. He had a falling out with his son, your grandfather Royce, that folks here talked about for years. Royce had gambling debts that followed him around like weather. Got mixed up with men down in the lower county that no decent person mixed up with. Thaddeus paid the first round. The second time, he said no. They stopped speaking sometime in the autumn of 1934. That's common knowledge around here for the few of us old enough to still know it. 1934. He looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. What about that year? Nothing, just the year. He held my gaze a half-second longer than the conversation required. You going out to the property today? Yes. Stone farmhouse, 11 acres, creek along the eastern boundary. He said it the way a man recites something he has been thinking about for a long time without meaning to. Take Hemlock Ridge Road south from the courthouse for 4 miles to a fork. Bear left uphill. You'll see the clearing before you reach the gate. Gate will be rusted, but not locked. A brief pause. If you have questions after you've been out there, come back. I'll be here. The way he said it had a quality I registered without yet understanding. Not unfriendly. Careful. Like a man who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right question and was not yet sure I was the one who would. I drove out. The farmhouse sat at the end of a lane of old sugar maples, whose buds were just beginning to redden in the April light. The property opened from the tree line into a wide, shallow clearing that sloped gently toward the sound of water. A creek ran along the eastern side fast and clear over pale stones. The house itself was built of gray granite field stone. 2 stories, deep-set windows, a roof that had been partially replaced. At some point, newer cedar shakes over older timbers. A mismatched repair that told the story of decades of minimal upkeep. A stone chimney rose from the rear of the structure, leaning fractionally, a few stones missing near the cap. The front door was solid oak, warped in its frame, the iron hinges gone orange with rust. Standing in front of it, I understood why Maxwell Vance had offered $9,000. On the surface, this was exactly what it appeared to be. A farmhouse at the end of a road no one used anymore on acreage that had gone to scrub and second-growth timber, its working years long behind it. But something else was true at the same time, a particular quality of stillness that the place carried. The way old stone holds quiet differently than wood or plaster. This house had been built by a man who meant it to last. The foundation was 3 feet thick, where the exterior corner had crumbled, exposing it. The window lintels were cut from single pieces of granite rather than mortared in sections. Every course of masonry was level and even. Whoever Thaddeus Holloway was, he had known how to build. I used the skeleton key on the front door. It fit the lock with the particular ease of a key made for that specific mechanism, turning with resistance and then a deep, solid click. The door swung inward. The smell hit first. Closed air. The specific mustiness of a space sealed for a long time, and underneath it something older, something mineral and cold, stone and time. I stepped inside. The front room was bare, plaster walls gone gray with age damp darkening the lower corners, a stone fireplace with a rusted grate, a staircase against the far wall, its treads worn smooth in the centers by years of use that had ended before I was born. On the walls, pale rectangles where pictures had hung the plaster slightly darker at the edges, where frames had slowed the slow fading of decades. I walked to the back room. The kitchen was larger than the front room, which surprised me. A stone sink with a hand pump, the mechanism seized solid with mineral deposit. Open shelves along one wall bare. A wood stove fitted into a stone alcove at the far end, its iron gone flat with rust. The floor was field stone flags, the same gray as the exterior walls set close and level by a hand that had not wasted a single cut. I stood in the center of the kitchen and looked down at the floor. Something about it was wrong. The flags were large and irregular in the natural way of hand-set stone fitted together with skill, and bedded in mortar gone gray and hard with age. All of them except a section near the back wall, beneath where the wood stove alcove jutted forward. There, 4 flags had been reset. The mortar around them was a slightly different color, paler, finer in texture, and the surface of the stone itself was marginally smoother, as if it had been lifted and relaid rather than placed in 1922 and left alone. It was subtle, the kind of detail a person would never notice unless they were standing still in a quiet room with nothing else to look at. I crouched. The seam between those 4 flags and the surrounding floor was fractionally wider than everywhere else. I pressed my palm flat against the stone. The temperature was different. The rest of the kitchen floor held the ambient cool of granite that has been sitting undisturbed for a century. These 4 flags were colder, not dramatically, not enough to be certain, but enough. I stood and looked at the back wall behind the wood stove alcove. At the base of the alcove, almost completely obscured by the forward projection of the stonework, I could just make out the edge of something. Dark iron hardware, the type used for heavy hinge brackets. I shifted sideways and crouched again. The wood stove alcove projected 18 inches from the back wall, and in the 2-foot gap between the side of the alcove and the corner of the room, there was a door. Not a wall door, a floor door. Its frame, cut into the granite foundation itself, fitted with iron brackets on 2 sides, and 2 heavy iron hasps bolted closed. The mortar along the door's edge had been applied in a thick, deliberate bead. The kind of seal a person applies when they are not planning to open something again. Where the mortar met the left side iron bracket, something was stamped into the metal. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The number was stamped in the heavy, slightly irregular numerals of a hand stamp. 1934. I sat back on my heels on the cold granite floor and looked at the sealed door and felt the silence of the house settle around me like stone settles around a fault line. Still, heavy, holding. Thaddeus Holloway had sealed this door in 1934. The same year he and his son had stopped speaking. The same autumn, according to Hollister Crane, that whatever passed between them had broken something so completely that 2 men in the same family had gone the rest of their lives without exchanging a single word. For Marin, when ready. My father had known. He had held this key for 22 years and paid his taxes every year and driven up here once in 2008 and walked through this house and seen this door and then driven away and never come back. And I did not yet know why. But I understood with the particular certainty that settles in your chest before your mind has finished working it out, that whatever was behind this door was the reason for all of it. The silence, the distance, the careful closed life of a man who worked a paper mill for 28 years and then a maintenance job for 7 more and left almost nothing behind. Almost nothing except this. I stood up. I walked through the kitchen and out the front door and sat on the granite step and pressed my hands flat against my knees to stop them from trembling. The creek ran in the distance steady and unhurried. A sugar maple at the edge of the clearing dropped a single red bud onto the gravel. A crow called once from somewhere in the tree line and went quiet. I had come here not knowing what I was looking for. I had come because my father left me a key and 4 words, and I had nowhere else to go. I had come because even with $300 and a futon in a friend's living room and an aunt who already had her eye on what she imagined was hers, it had felt like the only honest thing to do. And now I was sitting on the step of a stone farmhouse my great-grandfather had built with his own hands, and behind that floor door, sealed since 1934, something was waiting that no living person had ever seen. I needed tools. I needed help. And I needed to decide whether I was actually prepared to open it. Some part of me already understood that once I did everything before would become the old version of my life. I was still sitting on the step, the key warm now in my palm from the heat of my hand, when I heard tires on gravel. The car came up the maple lane slowly, the way a car drives when its driver has been on this road before and knows where the soft shoulder is. It was a black Cadillac sedan, recent model, the kind of vehicle that looked wrong on a road that ended in a creek. It stopped 20 feet from the porch, and a man got out. He was old. Not old the way Hollister Crane was old with the broad chest and the working hands. Old in the way of men who had spent their lives indoors and behind desks and giving orders. 82, I would learn later. Silver hair combed straight back from a high forehead. A long wool overcoat the color of a winter sky. A walking stick with a silver head shaped like a stag's antler. He moved slowly, but not feebly. He moved the way a man moves when he has decided that the world will wait for him, Miss Holloway. He did not extend his hand. He stopped at the foot of the granite step and looked up at me with eyes that had once been blue and had faded to something paler and more careful. Maxwell Vance, I believe you've spoken with the county attorney about my interest in this parcel. $9,000. The faintest movement at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. That offer was made to your father, who in my view was a man not motivated to sell. I have a feeling you're in a rather different position. He reached into the inside pocket of his overcoat and produced a folded sheet of paper. I'd like to make you a more serious offer. $28,000, cash, clean, closed in 2 weeks. You walk away with real money and none of the headaches of maintaining a structure that frankly is one bad winter from being a liability. $28,000. More money than I had earned in the past 2 years combined. Enough to pay down my student loans. Enough to put first and last on an apartment that wasn't Dorell's futon. Enough to breathe for the first time in my adult life without doing the arithmetic of survival every morning before I opened my eyes. I looked at him. My great-grandfather turned down money from men like you his whole life. My father turned you down for 22 years. Something shifted in his expression. The careful blue eyes did not move, but the air around them changed. Your great-grandfather was a stubborn old man who ended up dying alone in a house he wouldn't let his own son set foot in. Your father spent 22 years paying taxes on a property he never used because he couldn't decide whether he was a Holloway or not. A pause. With respect, Miss Holloway, their judgment in this matter wasn't exactly stellar. I'm not selling. He held the paper toward me a moment longer than necessary. Then he lowered it. The faint smile did not disappear. It became something else. I should tell you something, Miss Holloway, because you strike me as the kind of young woman who appreciates plain speech. This county does not always treat newcomers kindly, especially newcomers who are alone, especially newcomers who imagine that a piece of paper at the courthouse is the same thing as belonging here. The winters are long. The roads are bad. The neighbors are not always what they appear. He set the folded paper on the granite step beside my boot. My offer will not stay at 28. If you change your mind in the next few days, the number is on the paper. After that, I move on to other matters, and you are left with a stone house, 11 acres, and a great many things you did not anticipate. He turned and walked back to the Cadillac. He did not look at me again. The car backed slowly down the maple lane and disappeared around the bend. I sat on the step in the cold April light and held the folded paper and did not open it. The wind moved in the upper branches of the maples. The creek ran. Somewhere in the woods on the far side of the clearing, a single crow called and went quiet, and the silence that followed it was the silence of a place that had been waiting a very long time for someone to arrive. I drove back into Wexler Falls as the light began to fade. The motel on the edge of town was $47 a night. A double bed, a window looking out onto a gravel lot, a coffee maker on a particle board dresser. I paid in cash. The clerk did not ask my name twice. I lay on the bed in my coat and listened to a tractor-trailer downshift on the highway in the distance and tried to think clearly. $28,000 in my left hand. A sealed door and 4 words in my right. An aunt in Lowell who would be on the phone with a lawyer by morning. A man in a Cadillac who had used the word belonging the way other men use the word trespass. I closed my eyes. I saw my father sitting at the kitchen table in our old apartment in Berlin, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he never finished drinking, looking out the window at nothing. I saw him in the basement utility room 2 weeks ago, the wrench still in his hand, the building's day porter calling 911 from a phone clipped to his belt. I saw him driving up Hemlock Ridge Road in 2008, standing in that kitchen, looking at that door and turning around. He had been ready to know. He had not been ready to act. He had spent the rest of his life paying for someone else to be the one who finally was. I opened my eyes and looked at the ceiling and thought about Hollister Crane's careful voice at the hardware store counter. The way he had said, "Come back, I'll be here." The way he had looked at me when I said the year 1934. I drove out to the property one more time before I slept. I told myself I was going back to lock the front door, which was true. I told myself I had forgotten the skeleton key on the kitchen windowsill, which was also true. What I did not tell myself but understood anyway was that some part of me had already begun to suspect that the day was not yet finished with me. The clearing was full of long evening shadow when I pulled in. The maples were going dark against a sky still pale at the ridge. I parked beside the porch and walked up the granite step and stopped. The front door was not closed the way I had left it. I had pulled it shut with both hands and listened for the latch to click. I remembered the click. I remembered the resistance of the warped oak in the warped frame. The door was now open by perhaps 2 inches. The wood around the lock was scratched 3 pale gouges in the old finish, the kind a flat metal tool makes when it has been worked between a door and a jamb. I stood very still. The wind moved in the maples, the creek ran, the clearing was empty. I pushed the door open with the flat of my hand and stepped inside. The front room was as I had left it, the fireplace, the stairs, the pale rectangles on the wall. I walked through to the kitchen, my boots loud on the granite flags, now in a way they had not been an hour ago when the house had felt empty. The kitchen was as I had left it. The cold sink, the rusted stove, the 4 reset flags by the alcove, and the iron-banded door in the floor beside them. But on the dust of the kitchen floor between the doorway and the sealed cellar door, there were footprints. Not mine. Mine were narrow the tread of the work boots I had worn from Boston. These were wider, deeper. A man's boot. Fresh, since the dust had not yet resettled in them. They came in from the front room, crossed the kitchen, stopped at the sealed door, and turned around. They went back out the way they had come. Someone had been in this house since I had left it. Someone had walked directly to the door in the floor. Someone had stood in front of it and looked at it and then turned and walked away. I went back outside. In the gravel of the lane just past where I had parked were tire tracks I had not made. Wider than the Subarus, fresh. The print of a heavy tread. They came in from Hemlock Ridge Road, stopped near the porch, backed up, and went out again. I walked slowly to the Subaru, my heart moving in my chest in a way I could feel against the cotton of my shirt. The skeleton key was where I had left it on the kitchen windowsill, which meant whoever had come in had not been looking for the key. They had been looking at the door. I locked the front door behind me hard. I drove back to Wexler Falls through gathering dark, the maples on either side of Hemlock Ridge Road becoming a corridor of shadow, the headlights of the Subaru cutting a narrow tunnel through it. I did not see another car on the road. In the motel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for a long time. Maxwell Vance had been in his Cadillac with me less than an hour before someone had come up that lane and pried open my father's front door. $28,000 in cash, clean closed in 2 weeks. Or whatever this was. I thought about Hollister Crane, the way he had said, "Come back. I'll be here." I thought about the man at the hardware store going still when I said the year 1934. I thought about my father in 2008 standing in that kitchen and walking away. He had driven up here once, looked at the door, and gone home. He had not opened it. He had not told anyone. He had paid the taxes for the rest of his life and left the key under a false bottom in his toolbox for me. Whatever had been waiting in that house was not only waiting for the right person to come, it was waiting for the right person to come at a moment when the wrong people had begun to move. I lay down in my coat. I did not turn off the light. Outside the motel window, somewhere in the dark, a truck downshifted on the long grade out of town, and the sound carried for a long time across the fields. And then the night went quiet, and I held the skeleton key against my chest and waited for morning. I did not sleep. I lay in the motel bed with the lamp burning and the key warm against my collarbone and listened to the building settle around me, the click and hiss of old steam pipes in the walls, the long hum of a truck on the highway, the way silence in a strange place is never actually silent. I watched the gray light come up behind the curtain. I watched the curtain itself turn from black to the color of old paper. At 5:30, I got up. I made the bad motel coffee in the little plastic pot and drank it standing at the window and watched the gravel lot fill slowly with daylight. The first thing I did was call Lenora Whitlock. She answered on the third ring in the voice of a woman who had been awake for an hour already and was used to people calling earlier than they should. Miss Holloway. Someone was in the house last night. A pause. Tell me what you saw. I told her. The pried lock, the footprints across the dust, the tire tracks, the fact that Maxwell Vance had been on the property less than an hour before. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for several seconds, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. Still professional, but underneath the professional was something else now, something flatter and more careful. Miss Holloway, I am going to give you some advice. You are free to take it or not. Go ahead.
Talk to Hollister Crane this morning, before you do anything else, before you make any decisions about that property, before you go back out to it. Hollister has known the Vance family his entire life, and he has been waiting for someone in your family to come into his store and ask the questions you are about to ask. Go and ask them. Why has he been waiting? Because of his father. A pause. Just go talk to him. I drank the rest of the bad coffee. I drove to Main Street. The hardware store was already open when I arrived. The wood stove at the back was lit. Hollister was behind the counter with a ledger book and a pencil working through numbers in the slow, careful hand of a man who had been keeping his own books for 40 years and did not see any reason to change. He looked up when the bell chimed over the door. He took me in. The unslept eyes, the coat I had not taken off since yesterday afternoon. He set the pencil down. Coffee. Please. He came back from the small kitchen at the rear of the store with 2 mugs and set one in front of me. He pulled a stool out from behind the counter and set it on my side. The gesture of a man preparing for a conversation he had been preparing for a long time. He sat heavily. You want to tell me what happened? I told him. The Cadillac, the folded paper on the granite step, the pried door an hour later, the footprints leading to the cellar door and back. He listened without moving. When I was finished, he wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and stared at the surface of the liquid for a long time. Then he said, My father was the Coos County Sheriff's deputy
for the Eastern Townships, 1948 to 1955. He was 32 years old when he died. I was 4. I waited.
His name was Wendell Crane. He was a good man. He was the kind of man who would write you a parking ticket and apologize about it. He was also a man who could read a ledger and tell you which numbers had been added after the original entries. Hollister turned the mug slowly between his palms. In the spring of 1955, he started looking into a series of land transactions that had taken place between 1928 and 1934. 7 properties along the eastern slope of Hemlock Ridge. 7 small farms,
Sold under what the records described as voluntary terms. My father had become convinced the terms were not voluntary. Vance?
He nodded once slowly.
Cornelius Vance, Maxwell's father, the patriarch at the time. A man who had built the Vance Lumber Company out of nothing during the Great War, and who had spent the 20s and 30s expanding it through what he called acquisitions, and what other men in this county called something less polite. Hollister paused. My father had begun interviewing the surviving families. He had gone as far as obtaining a sworn affidavit from one of the original sellers, an old man named Eldred Trask, who told him that Cornelius Vance had sent 2 men to his barn at night in 1932 and explained to him in plain language that the bank holding his mortgage would be calling the note unless he sold his upper acreage to Vance Lumber at a price Vance set. The bank president was Cornelius Vance's brother-in-law. The note was called. Eldred Trask sold. He sold the property his father had homesteaded in 1881 for 1/3 of its appraised value, and he spent the rest of his life on a rented farm 3 valleys west, telling no one what had happened because he had a wife and 4 children, and the men who had come to his barn had been very specific about what would happen to all of them if he did. Hollister set the mug down. My father planned to take Eldred Trask's affidavit along with the affidavits he was still collecting from the other 6 families to the state attorney general in Concord in July of 1955. He didn't. He fell into the gorge at the bottom of Pell's Falls, about a mile downstream from your property, the 3rd week of June. The official cause of death was an accidental slip while fishing. There was no fishing rod recovered. There was no creel. He had not, to my mother's knowledge, owned a fishing rod in his adult life. The kitchen of the hardware store was very quiet around us. The wood stove ticked. A truck passed slowly on Main Street, and its sound faded down toward the river. My mother raised me with the affidavits in a sealed envelope under our bed. She told me about them when I was 19 years old. She said that as long as Cornelius Vance was alive, she would not act on them because she did not intend to bury her son the way she had buried her husband. Cornelius Vance died in 1968. By the time my mother went to the Attorney General's office in Concord, the surviving witnesses she had named in the affidavits were either dead or had recanted,
or had moved out of state and refused to be located. The case did not move. He lifted his eyes to mine. But my father had been right. He had been right about all of it. He had simply been right at the wrong time.
I sat with the weight of that for a long moment.
Why are you telling me this now?
Because your father came into this store in May of 2008. He sat where you are sitting. He was 34 years old. He told me his name, and I told him mine. And he looked at me the way you are looking at me now. And he asked me what I knew about the year 1934. We talked for 2 hours. He asked me about my father. He asked me about the 7 families. He asked me whether I had ever seen the inside of his great-grandfather's cellar. Had you?
No, but I had a theory. So did your father by the time he left this store that afternoon.
What was his theory?
That Thaddeus Holloway had been collecting his own evidence, quietly, from his own neighbors, from the men Cornelius Vance had crushed, and that whatever Thaddeus had collected, he had sealed beneath the kitchen floor of that house in the autumn of 1934, when his son Royce had agreed to deliver it to Cornelius Vance in exchange for the cancellation of a gambling debt. I felt the chair under me as a specific object for the first time. The cold of the metal legs against the floor, the grain of the wood under my hand on the counter.
My grandfather was going to sell it.
Royce Holloway was going to walk into his father's house in November of 1934, take whatever was in that cellar, and hand it to Cornelius Vance. In exchange, the $1,100 he owed to a man named Asa Bell in Lower Coos would have disappeared. Hollister paused. Thaddeus caught him in the kitchen at 3 a.m. with a pry bar in his hand. He did not strike him. He did not shout. He told his son to walk out the front door and not come back, and Royce did. The following week, Thaddeus sealed the cellar door with iron and mortar that was meant to outlast everyone then living, including himself. And then he wrote a letter which my father, in his last weeks of life, believed Thaddeus had placed inside the cellar, addressed to whichever descendant eventually proved worthy enough to open it. For Marin, when ready? He looked at me a long moment. He nodded once.
Your father came up here in 2008 to find that letter, to finish what my father had started. He had the key. He had the suspicion. He stood in that kitchen, Marin, and he could not do it. He came back into this store that afternoon, and he sat where you are sitting, and he told me in those words that he was not the right man. He said he had a daughter who was 4 years old, and that he was not going to put her on a different road than the one she was already on.
He said he would pay the taxes and keep the key and trust that someone in his line would eventually be ready. I did not say anything. I could not say anything. Hollister reached under the counter and lifted out a metal cash box. He opened it. From beneath a tray of receipts and small bills, he removed a folded sheet of paper gone soft at the creases. He set it on the counter between us. He left this here for you. The day he drove home. He said, if anyone with his last name and his eyes ever came into this store asking about 1934, I was to give it to her. The paper was thick, The handwriting on it was my father's careful block print. Marin, if you are reading this, you have already come further than I did. I am sorry I never told you. I did not know how. I did not have the words. I hope Hollister Crane is still alive. I hope he has told you what he told me. I hope the house has not been burned in the meantime. There is a key in my toolbox. You have already found it, or you would not be here. Open the cellar. Read the letter. Decide for yourself. Do not let anyone, including your aunt, including any man named Vance,
Tell you what to do with what you find. The land is yours. The truth is yours. The choice is yours. I love you. Dad. I held the paper. I read it twice. I read it a third time. I folded it back along its creases and put it inside my jacket against the skeleton key. I lifted my eyes to Hollister Crane and I said, I need tools. Something moved across his face that I had not seen there before. The first real smile, slow, genuine. The kind of smile that came from a place he had not been able to use in a long time. I'll get you set up. He walked me through the store himself. Cold chisels in 2 sizes. A 2-pound club hammer. A heavy pry bar. A crowbar long enough to give me leverage on the door itself once the seal was broken. A high-powered flashlight. 2 spare battery packs. A pair of leather work gloves. A knee pad because he said that kitchen floor is granite and you are going to be on your knees for the better part of a day. He added a propane lantern at the end without asking, and a folding camp chair
And a length of nylon rope. What for? In case the stairs down into that cellar have rotted out from under themselves over 92 years, and you need to be lowered. You've thought about this. For most of my life, Miss Holloway. At the counter, he refused payment. Your great-grandfather rebuilt the stone wall around my grandfather's pasture in 1931. Took him 3 weeks. Would not accept $1 for the labor. Told my grandfather neighbors look after neighbors, and the bill was paid when my grandfather did the same for someone else someday. He pushed the bag of tools across the counter. Consider this looking after. I carried the bag to the Subaru. The morning sun was a thin, pale disk over the spruce ridge above town. I stopped at Pell's for the first real meal I had eaten in 2 days' scrambled eggs and toast and bacon and bottomless coffee served by a woman in her 60s named Doreen, who did not ask me a single personal question and who refilled my cup 4 times. I left her a tip that was too large. I drove back out toward Hemlock Ridge Road with the bag of tools in the passenger seat and the camp chair in the back, and the morning light beginning to do something to the maple lane that almost looked like spring. I had been at the property maybe 20 minutes unloading tools into the kitchen when I heard a car come up the lane. It was not the Cadillac. It was a silver Mercedes SUV, and behind it a second car, a dark sedan with Massachusetts plates. They parked side by side near the porch. The doors of both vehicles opened almost simultaneously. From the Mercedes stepped a man I had never seen in his late 50s, wearing a wool topcoat over a suit and an expression I recognized from television. He had a leather briefcase, From the sedan stepped Aunt Beatrice in a long camel coat I had never seen her wear, and Holden in jeans and a windbreaker, his phone already in his hand. Beatrice walked up to the porch as if she had been here before. She had not. "Marin, we need to talk. You drove 4 hours." "Yes, I did. Without calling." Calls don't go through to people who don't want to have conversations. This is Edmund Halstead. He's an attorney from Lowell. He represents the family interest. Edmund Halstead extended a soft hand. I did not take it. "Miss Holloway, pleased to meet you. May we step inside?" "No." "Pardon?" "You may not step inside." Beatrice's mouth tightened. "Marin, don't be difficult." "Aunt Beatrice, you are standing on the porch of a house your brother left to me. You drove here unannounced with a lawyer. You did not knock. You did not call. The answer to whether you may step inside is no. The answer to anything you have come to say to me is, you may say it here on the porch, where I can close the door and lock it when you are finished." Edmund Halstead cleared his throat in the manner of a man who had been paid to manage situations exactly like this and had not yet earned his fee. "Miss Holloway, my client has retained me to explore the question of whether the estate of Mr. Lyle Holloway was properly distributed under New Hampshire intestacy law. There are certain provisions under which a sibling of the decedent may have a claim against real property in the absence of a... I read the statute last night." He blinked. "I'm sorry. I read the statute last night on the motel Wi-Fi. New Hampshire, RSA 561. Real property of a decedent who dies intestate passes to lineal descendants if any exist. I am a lineal descendant. There are no others. My aunt as a sibling has no claim against this real property. She would have a claim against personal property only if no lineal descendants existed, which is not the case." I looked at Beatrice. "Did you bring him all the way up here without telling him there is a daughter?" A flush rose in Beatrice's throat. Holden, who had been silent until now, snorted. "Christ, Mom. Holden, shut up. You said the kid wouldn't know the law." "Holden." Edmund Halstead was looking at his briefcase with the expression of a man recalculating his hourly rate against the long drive home. "Miss Holloway, there may be other avenues, equity arguments, constructive trust theories. The fact remains that this property has been in your family for..." "Mr. Halstead, with respect, I am 22 years old. I am running on 3 hours of bad motel sleep, and I have been threatened twice in the last 16 hours by men with more money than my father made in his entire life. I have nothing left in me this morning for equity arguments. The land was left to me. It is mine. If your client has any further questions, she can write me a letter. Not call. Write. I want a paper trail." I stepped backward into the front room and closed the oak door. I locked it. I stood with my back against the door and listened to muffled voices on the porch. Beatrice sharp and Holden mocking, and Halstead unintelligible. And then the sound of car doors and engines and gravel and silence. I waited until the silence had held for a full minute. Then I went into the kitchen and pulled on the leather gloves and picked up the cold chisel and the club hammer
and knelt down by the sealed door in the floor and began to work. The first hour was the hardest. The mortar Thaddeus had used was not ordinary mortar. It was dense and dark, almost tar, like something mixed with the intention of permanence. I positioned the chisel against the bead along the near edge of the door frame, raised the hammer, and struck. The chisel bit perhaps a quarter inch and stuck. I struck again. The mortar cracked in a small radius around the chisel tip and held. I worked it free, moved the chisel 2 inches along the seam, struck again. The cold of the granite came up through the knee pad and through my jeans. My right arm ached from the impact traveling up through the hammer. Dust rose in small white puffs, with each strike settling on my hands and on the front of my coat and in my hair. The sound of iron on stone filled the kitchen and went nowhere absorbed by the thick walls. I worked along the near edge, striking and repositioning a few inches at a time. I was on the third edge when I heard the second car. I knew before I went to the window who it was. The black Cadillac was not in the lane this time. In its place stood a dark green pickup truck, mud splattered along the wheel wells, a winch on the front bumper. The man who had stepped out of it was not Maxwell. He was younger by 25 years, broader, heavier through the shoulders, a canvas barn coat over a flannel shirt, a face that had been shaped by weather and impatience in roughly equal measure. He did not walk up to the porch. He stood beside the truck and waited. He had the posture of a man who had been told to wait, but only barely. I went out. "Miss Holloway?" "Yes." "Davis Vance." He did not extend his hand. He did not need to. He was standing close enough to the porch that his weight on the gravel was a presence I could feel through the soles of my boots. "My father came to see you yesterday afternoon." "He did." "He left you a number." "He did." He thought 28 was generous. I think 28 was generous. I am also of the opinion that a young woman from Boston alone on a property with no working utilities in a county where she does not know a single soul should not be in the business of saying no to generous numbers. I am not alone. He looked past me at the empty porch and the empty clearing and back at me. "Whatever you're telling yourself, Miss Holloway." "What do you want, Mr. Vance?" His mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I want you to take a number that gets you back to wherever you came from. Today is 52,000, cash. Same terms as yesterday, clean. Closed in 10 days. After today, the offer goes down by 10% every 24 hours. And at some point, fairly soon, it goes to 0. After 0, what happens to this property is no longer something I will be involved in. $52,000. I felt the number move through me, the arithmetic of survival. The first and last on an apartment that wasn't Dorell's futon. The student loans. The chance to breathe. I held his eyes. "My father turned your father down every year for 22 years. Your father was a stubborn paper mill mechanic who got himself killed in a basement at 62. You don't speak about him. Something moved in his face that I had not seen yet. The faint smile sharpened.
I'll speak about him however I please, Miss Holloway. Your father was nobody to me. Your great-grandfather was nobody to my grandfather. You are nobody to my father. There is a pattern here. You might want to think about it. Get off my land! He did not move for a long second. Then he stepped backward one step, then another. He walked to the truck. He opened the door. Before he climbed in, he looked back at me one more time. You are going to want to lock that door tonight, Miss Holloway. Lock it well. He drove out the maple lane. I stood on the porch and watched the truck disappear around the bend and listened to the engine fade down toward Hemlock Ridge Road. When it was gone, I went back inside, locked the front door, and called Hollister Crane from the kitchen. Davis just left. Tell me what he said. I told him. The 52,000, the decreasing number, the line about locking the door tonight.
Hollister was quiet for a long beat. I'm coming out there at 10 p.m. I'll park down at the bend in Hemlock Ridge so my truck isn't visible from the road. I'm going to sit in the dark on your porch tonight with a thermos of coffee and a shotgun I have not had to use in 40 years. Hollister. Marin, don't argue.
I wasn't going to.
Good. Get the cellar open before dark if you can. Whatever is down there, you want it in your hands before the night comes, not still under the floor.
I hung up. I went back to the door. I worked through the afternoon. The light moved across the kitchen and changed angles. By 4 o'clock, 3 of the 4 edges were free. The mortar was coming away in larger chunks now, some of them dropping from the seam as solid pieces 3 inches long. I could see the iron frame of the door more clearly. It was dark, not rusted through. The 4th edge took another 40 minutes. The mortar there was the thickest, applied in a deep bead that filled not only the gap between the door and the surrounding stone, but extended up and over the lower lip of the iron bracket itself. Thaddeus had not wanted this door opened. He had sealed it with everything he had, with the same care and precision he had put into every stone of the house above it. When the last piece came free, I sat back on my heels and looked at the door in its entirety. Oak, iron banded, perhaps 2 inches thick. The iron bands tarnished but solid. The 2 hasps bolted through iron plates set into the stone frame on either side, secured with heavy iron padlocks that had gone dark with age. I inserted the skeleton key into the first padlock. It turned stiff, requiring both hands and most of my strength, but it turned. The shackle released with a sound that was startlingly loud in the silent kitchen. The second lock opened the same way. I lifted both hasps clear of their plates and straightened up. I set the pry bar under the edge of the door and applied pressure. The weight of it, the friction of the iron frame against the stone. After 92 years of stillness, the door moved just a fraction, just enough to break the seal of suction. And then a sound came from beneath it that stopped everything. Air, a release of air from the space below, cold and dry, carrying a smell that was the opposite of the outside world, the opposite of creek water and maple buds and April mud. The smell of a room that had been undisturbed since 1934. Paper, old wood, the particular mineral smell of granite that had been closed away from weather for almost a century. Something faint and almost sweet beneath it, like beeswax. Like the memory of a candle. I stood completely still with both hands on the pry bar and let the air pass. Then I took the crowbar, worked it under the door, and pulled. The door came up on its hinges, heavy and deliberate, swinging outward until it rested open against the granite floor. A rectangle of absolute darkness waited below. Stone steps, 5 of them, descending into a space I could not yet see. I picked up the flashlight, turned it on, and pointed it down. The cellar was not large, maybe 14 feet by 10. The ceiling low enough that I would have to duck slightly. The walls of fitted granite, tight and dry. Wooden shelving ran along 3 walls, rough-hewn planks on iron brackets, the wood dark with age and dry as bone. The floor was packed earth, hard and cold. I went down the steps, one at a time, one hand on the wall. The flashlight beam swept the shelves, and what I saw made me stop. On the left wall in careful rows were metal tins. Old, the kind used for storing bulk goods in the Depression years, the labels faded but legible. Beside them, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, were bundles of papers. On the right wall, wooden boxes, perhaps 12 of them. Their lids fitted flush and sealed with a thin bead of wax along each edge. But on the back wall, in the center of a section of shelving that had been cleared for it specifically, was something else. Not a wooden box, not bundled papers, a metal strongbox, iron-banded, smaller than the wooden boxes around it, older. The kind a man might use to keep documents he expected to outlive him. I went to the wooden boxes first. I lifted the nearest one down. It was heavy. I set it on the packed earth floor and worked my fingers under the lid and pried it open. The wax seal gave without resistance, dry and crumbling, its job done. Inside, in neat stacks separated by squares of cloth, were coins, gold coins, each one perhaps 1.25 inches in diameter. Heavy. Their surfaces dulled by age, but their features still sharp. A woman's profile in flowing robes, a torch raised in one hand, an olive branch in the other. On the reverse, an eagle in flight, wings spread wide. Around the edge of each coin, the inscription, United States of America. $20. St. Gaudens double eagles, $20 gold pieces. Minted before 1933, before Franklin Roosevelt's executive order had required Americans to surrender their gold to the Federal Reserve. Thaddeus Holloway had not surrendered his. I counted the coins in the first box. 64. I lifted the second box, opened it. 61. There were 12.
I sat down on the packed earth floor and tried to hold the information steady in my mind, and could not quite manage it. The flashlight beam was shaking. I set it down on a shelf and folded my hands in my lap and tried to breathe. The oilcloth bundles on the left wall were war bonds, Series E, hundreds of them in their original sleeves. Pre-war silver certificates, pristine large format currency in denominations that had not been printed in 80 years. And then I went to the metal strongbox on the back wall. It had its own small lock. The skeleton key did not fit it, but Thaddeus had left a smaller key tied to the handle on a piece of waxed string, and that key fit, and the lock turned with a soft click, and I lifted the lid. Inside, in careful order, were the things my father had driven up here to find in 2008, and could not bring himself to read. A leather-bound journal, the cover dark with age, the spine cracked but intact. I opened the cover. The first page bore the inscription, "Account of the acquisitions of Cornelius Vance, Vance Lumber Company, 1928 to 1934. Compiled by Thaddeus Holloway, with the assistance of those who could not safely speak." Beneath the journal, a stack of photographs. Sepia-toned edges curled but clear. Photographs of contracts laid flat on a table, the signature lines visible. Photographs of bank correspondence. Photographs of two men I did not recognize, standing in front of a barn, their faces hard and unhappy. The men Cornelius Vance had sent. Beneath the photographs, 7 signed affidavits. 7 small farmers, each one swearing under oath in 1933 and 1934 that they had sold their land to Cornelius Vance under threat. Each one giving the dates, the amounts, the names of the men who had come to their barns at night. Each one giving the name of the bank president who had called their notes. Each one giving the appraised value of what they had lost and the price they had been forced to accept. The first affidavit on the stack was signed by Eldred Trask, the same Eldred Trask whose affidavit 60 years later Hollister Crane's father had been carrying when he fell into the gorge at Pell's Falls in June of 1955. Beneath the affidavits at the bottom of the strongbox was a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, soft as cloth. The handwriting on the front was Thaddeus Holloway's careful, unhurried hand. Open only when Vance still holds power. Otherwise, burn unread. I sat in my great-grandfather's cellar with the flashlight on the shelf beside me and the envelope in my hand and tried to slow my breathing. The granite walls held the cold around me. Above me, through the open cellar door, I could hear the last of the afternoon light moving across the kitchen, and somewhere far off in the trees, a single crow calling its long, flat call across the clearing. I opened the envelope. Inside was a document, 5 pages neatly folded. A deed of title recorded at the Coos County Registry of Deeds in March of 1922. The recording stamp was clear. The seal was intact.
The signatures were original in faded brown ink. The deed conveyed to Thaddeus Holloway in his own name, and the names of his heirs in perpetuity, the title to a parcel of 340 acres of high meadow and timberland along the eastern slope of Hemlock Ridge. The same 340 acres that, according to the recorded history of Coos County, had been sold to Vance Lumber Company in 1932 by 7 separate small farmers under what the records described as voluntary terms. But the underlying title to those 340 acres had never belonged to those 7 farmers. The farmers had held only working tenancies. The freehold title to the land beneath them had been quietly held by Thaddeus Holloway since 1922. He had bought it from the original homesteader's estate. He had let the 7 families work it under generations-old verbal agreements. He had never put his name on the surface, which meant that the contracts Cornelius Vance had forced those 7 families to sign had transferred to Vance Lumber Company, a property that the 7 families had not legally owned. Vance Lumber Company had paid for stolen land that had never actually changed hands, and Vance Lumber Company had been building on it, logging it, and most recently developing a luxury alpine resort on it for 92 years. I sat in the cellar in the cold and held the deed and understood slowly in pieces what I had come into possession of. Above me, somewhere in the gathering dusk over Hemlock Ridge, a truck engine downshifted on the long grade. The sound carried down through the front room and the kitchen and the open cellar door. It came up the maple lane. It stopped near the porch. I heard a vehicle door open. I heard boots on gravel. I heard the front door rattle against its lock. I turned off the flashlight. I crouched on the packed earth floor of the cellar with the deed in one hand and the flashlight gone dark in the other, and I listened. The front door rattled a second time. The lock held. There was a pause. Then the slow, careful sound of footsteps moving along the porch around the side of the house toward the kitchen window. A boot on stone. A second boot. The footsteps stopped beneath the kitchen window. They waited there for what felt like a full minute. Then they moved on around to the back toward the door that opened from the kitchen onto the small stone stoop above the creek. I had not locked the back door. I had not even checked it. I heard the latch turn. I heard the back door open. I heard a boot come down on the granite floor of the kitchen above me. I did not breathe. The boot took one step, stopped, took another, stopped. The man was listening for me the way I was listening for him. He took a third step, and now I knew where he was standing. He was at the edge of the open cellar door. He was looking down into the dark. I could not see him from where I crouched. The angle of the steps blocked my line of sight, but I could hear his breathing, slow, controlled. The breathing of a man who had been here before, in some other house, in some other situation, and who knew
how this kind of work was done. Then a voice, quiet, close. Miss Holloway.
It was not Davis Vance. It was a voice I had not heard before. Younger, flatter. The voice of a man who was being paid by the hour and who did not care to be here any longer than the job required. Miss Holloway, I know you are down there. I am not here to hurt you. I am here to collect some property of mine that you have come into possession of by accident. If you will hand it up the stairs, I will leave the way I came, and nothing further will happen tonight. I did not answer.
The voice was patient.
Miss Holloway, I have a flashlight. I am going to turn it on now, and I'm going to come down those stairs. You can make this take 30 seconds, or you can make it take longer. I do not have a preference. A beam of light snapped on above me and swept down into the cellar. It caught the wooden boxes on the right wall. It caught the oilcloth bundles on the left. It swept past me once without finding me, because I had pressed myself flat against the granite under the lip of the bottom step, and the angle was wrong for the beam to catch me without the man bending his knees to look. He did not bend his knees yet. The beam swept back. He had seen the open strongbox on the back shelf. He came down one step, then another. That was when, from somewhere above us, somewhere up at the bend in the Maple Lane, where Hemlock Ridge Road turned out toward the highway, a single horn sounded. 2 long blasts. A pause. 2 more. The man on the cellar steps froze. He held the flashlight steady on the back wall for another second. Then the beam swung up and away. The boots reversed up the stone steps in 3 fast strides. I heard the back door open and shut. I heard boots crossing the gravel along the creek side of the house at a run. I heard a vehicle engine somewhere down the slope, hidden in the trees, kick over and pull away. I did not move for a long time. I sat under the lip of the cellar steps in the cold dark and listened to my own breathing come back to me and to the silence of the house settle again around me. Above me from the kitchen, I heard a second set of boots come in through the front door. These were heavier, slower. They crossed the front room and stopped at the top of the cellar steps.
Marin,
Hollister Crane's voice.
I'm here.
Are you hurt?
No, I'm coming down.
Don't. I'm coming up. I climbed the 5 stone steps with the deed in my jacket and the strongbox in my hands, and the leather journal pressed against my ribs under my coat. At the top of the steps, Hollister was standing with a long flashlight in one hand, and what I could now see was an old shotgun broken open over his forearm. He looked at me, and his face did something I had not seen on it before. The careful held face of an old man broke open, and behind it was relief so complete it bordered on grief. Are you sure?
I'm sure. He came in the back.
Yes. I should have driven up sooner. I was going to come at 10. I had a feeling around 8. I should have trusted the feeling. You did trust it. You're here. He looked down at what was in my arms. Is that it? This is it. He set the shotgun against the wall and reached out and put a hand on my shoulder, briefly, the way an older man puts a hand on someone he has spent a long time waiting for. Then he took it away. Let's get the rest of it out of the ground. Tonight. 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 Whatever you found, you do not want it under that floor for another hour. We move it to a place where it cannot be reached, and then we move it again in the morning to a place where the law is. We worked for 3 hours. Hollister set up the propane lantern in the kitchen, and we carried up the 12 wooden boxes one at a time, sliding them across the granite floor on a quilt he had brought from his truck, because he had thought ahead even about that. We carried up the oilcloth bundles. We carried up the metal tins. We loaded everything into the bed of Hollister's pickup under a tarp. He drove it the 4 miles into Wexler Falls and into the locked back room of the hardware store, where his grandfather had once kept the rifles during deer season, and where the walls were the thick old brick of a building put up in 1908. He came back at midnight with 2 folding cots and a thermos of soup. He set up the cots in the front room of the farmhouse and built a fire in the stone fireplace from kindling and split oak he had also brought. He sat in one of the cots with the shotgun across his knees and told me to take the other and sleep. I did not believe I would be able to. I was asleep within 10 minutes. I woke before dawn. The fire had burned down to coals. Hollister was awake in the same position, the shotgun still across his knees. You didn't sleep. I'm 75. I don't need much. You stayed up all night. I did. Hollister. Marin. He did not look at me when he said it. My father did not get to finish what he started. I have spent my whole life understanding that. I was not going to spend the rest of it understanding that I sat in my own house 6 miles down the road while the same thing happened to you. I did not answer him. I went to the kitchen and made coffee on the propane stove he had also brought. At 7 a.m., I called the office of the New Hampshire Attorney General in Concord and asked to be transferred to the Public Integrity Unit. A woman named Annette Forsyth took my call. I told her in plain order what I had found. The deed, the journal, the 7 affidavits, the photographs, the sealed envelope my great-grandfather had placed at the bottom of the strongbox in 1934. The fact that Vance Mountain Resort was at that moment under construction on land that legally belonged to the descendants of 7 Coos County families who had been forced to surrender it under duress 94 years ago. I told her about the man who had come into the house last night. She listened without speaking until I had finished. Then she asked me to hold for 1 minute. The minute lasted 4. When she came back on the line, her voice had changed. Miss Holloway, I am going to ask you to do exactly what I tell you. We are sending a state police escort to Wexler Falls this morning.
They will arrive at the hardware store on Main Street at 11 a.m. You and Mr. Crane will turn the materials over to them, and they will transport everything under chain of custody to our office in Concord. You and Mr. Crane will follow them down in a separate vehicle. You will give a formal statement here at 1:30 this afternoon. The FBI Boston field office is being notified within the next 30 minutes. Do you understand? Yes. Miss Holloway, one more thing. Do not return to that house alone today. Not for any reason. Not to lock a door. Not to collect a coat. If something has been left behind, it can be retrieved when this is over. I understand. Good. The state police arrived at the hardware store at 5 minutes before 11. 2 unmarked sedans, 4 troopers in plain clothes, a single officer in uniform. They were professional and quiet. They photographed the materials in the back room. They inventoried each item. They sealed each box and labeled each seal. They loaded everything into the trunks of the 2 sedans. The lead trooper, a woman in her 40s whose name I did not catch and never asked, handed me a card with the number to call if anything further happened in Wexler Falls in the next 24 hours. She did not say what she meant by anything further. She did not need to. Hollister drove behind the sedans in his pickup with the shotgun on the floor of the cab. I rode beside him. The drive south to Concord took 3 hours. The mountains gave way to the foothills. The foothills gave way to the rolling country of central New Hampshire. The rolling country gave way to the long, flat approach to the capital. We did not talk much. There was nothing left between us that needed saying out loud. The interview at the Attorney General's office took 6 hours. Annette Forsyth was a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and the kind of patient, unwavering attention that comes from 20 years of doing one thing and doing it well. She took my statement in detail. She asked me to walk through every conversation I had had since I had arrived in Coos County. She had me identify Maxwell Vance and Davis Vance from photographs. She had me describe the voice of the man on the cellar steps. She had me read aloud from my great-grandfather's journal while a court reporter typed every word. She asked me 3 separate times in different ways whether I had ever been alone in the same room with any item of evidence and whether I had altered, removed, or added anything. I told her no 3 times. At the end of the day, she shook my hand and told me I should expect this process to take 18 months and that I would not need to live through any part of it alone if I did not wish to. Hollister drove me back to Wexler Falls that night. We did not talk about the day. We listened to the radio in his truck, an AM station out of Manchester, playing music neither of us was young enough for, and both of us were old enough to remember. 2 days later, Aunt Beatrice called. I was sitting at Doreen's counter at Pell's Diner, eating eggs and toast, when my phone rang. I almost did not answer. I answered. She was crying. Not the funeral cry, not the parking lot cry. This was different. This was the cry of a woman who had spent 2 days unable to sleep and had finally picked up the phone because the only thing worse than the conversation in front of her
was the conversation she had been having with herself. Marin, I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you before you find out some other way. I set my fork down. Tell me. Last month, right after Lyle died, I got a call. A man. He didn't give me a last name. He said his name was Davis, and he was calling on behalf of a family business in northern New Hampshire that had a long-standing interest in your father's property. He said he understood your father had passed without a will. He said he understood there might be complications about who the property went to. He said his family was prepared to make a substantial private payment to anyone who could help guide the situation toward a sale. Beatrice. $60,000, Marin. $60,000 if I could persuade you to take their offer. He said the property had nothing of real value on it. He said it had some old family papers that were a little embarrassing, and that's why they wanted it. He said your great-grandfather had been involved in some shady business in the 30s, and the family wanted it kept private, and the $60,000 was just to make the process easy. He said it was an embarrassment payment, not a bribe. He used those exact words. I closed my eyes. Did you take it? No. He said he would send the first half when I agreed in principle. I agreed in principle. He sent $30,000 to my account 2 weeks ago. It is still sitting in my account. I have not spent a single dollar of it. I did not know what was actually up there, Marin. I thought it was some embarrassing thing about an affair or a bad business deal from 100 years ago. I thought I was going to get $60,000, and you were going to get a lump sum from Maxwell Vance, and everybody was going to walk away with something. I did not know about the farmers. I did not know about Hollister Crane's father. I did not know about any of it. When I came up there with Halstead, I was trying to give you a reason to take the deal. I thought I was helping you, Marin. I am old enough that I should have known better, and I did not. She was crying so hard now that I had trouble understanding her. I recorded the second call. After he sent the money, I told him I needed to hear him say again what the money was for before I went up to talk to you. I told him I needed it on a voicemail because I was afraid I would lose my nerve. He left a voicemail. He said it all again. He said the words, "Help us bury what is up there." And he said the words, "We have buried bigger things than this." And he laughed when he said it, Marin. He laughed. I have the recording. I am sending it to you now. I am sending it to whoever you tell me to send it to. I do not want the money. I do not want any of it. I want my brother back. I cannot have my brother back. I want to do one thing in this that does not make me hate myself when I see my face in the mirror tomorrow morning. I sat at the counter at Pell's and listened to my aunt cry, and I did not know what to say to her. Beatrice? Yes. Send the recording to Annette Forsyth at the New Hampshire Attorney General's office. I will text you her number in 2 minutes. Do not delete anything from your phone. Do not delete anything from your bank. Do not speak to anyone named Vance again. Do not speak to Edmund Halstead again. If anyone other than Annette Forsyth contacts you about this, you tell them to call her. Yes. Beatrice. Yes. Thank you.
There was a long silence on the line.
You should not be thanking me for this, Marin. I know, I am anyway. I hung up. I sat at Doreen's counter with my eggs cooling in front of me. I texted the number to Beatrice. I called Annette Forsyth. I told her what was coming. She said, "That changes the case. That changes everything about the case." The third break in the case came from a woman I had not yet met. Her name was Verna Trask. She was 78 years old. She lived in a small white house on the western edge of Wexler Falls, in a neighborhood of small white houses built for mill workers in the 1940s. Hollister had mentioned her once in passing during one of the long, quiet conversations we had had over coffee at the hardware store, but I had not yet gone to see her. She came to see me. It was a Saturday morning, 11 days after the state police had taken the materials to Concord. I was at the farmhouse with Hollister and a stonemason from the next county named Eldon Markham, walking the exterior of the building to identify what would be needed in the way of repointing when a green Ford station wagon, perhaps 20 years old, came up the maple lane very slowly. The driver was a small woman in a navy coat. She parked beside the porch and got out and stood beside her car and waited. Hollister went to her. He spoke to her quietly. He brought her over.
"Marin, this is Verna Trask. She is Eldred Trask's granddaughter." The name landed in my chest. Eldred Trask, the first signatory of the 7 affidavits. The man who had told Hollister's father in 1955 what Cornelius Vance had done to him in 1932. Verna Trask was small and bird-boned, with hair gone fully white, and eyes that were very clear behind a pair of old reading glasses pushed down on her nose. She held a leather satchel against her chest with both hands. "Miss Holloway, I have been waiting 47 years to give this to someone." "Mrs. Trask."
My grandfather kept a journal, same as your great-grandfather did, though they did not know about each other's. He started keeping it in 1929, and he kept it until he died in 1956. My grandmother gave it to my father when he died. My father gave it to me when he died in 1979. He told me to give it to whichever member of the Holloway family ever opened the door at the stone farmhouse on Hemlock Ridge Road. He had heard the story from Hollister's father about what was supposedly under that floor. He believed it. He told me to keep watch. He told me that as long as a Vance still walked Main Street, the journal was mine to protect, and that one day a Holloway would come and the journal would be hers. She held the satchel out. I took it. "I want you to know something, Miss Holloway. My grandfather's journal does not have the same kind of evidence in it that yours does. It does not have photographs. It does not have signed contracts. What it has is 40 years of one man writing down what was done to his neighbors and to himself in plain language every single year on the anniversary of the day they came to his barn. He did not write it for a court. He wrote it because he could not bear to die without telling someone. He wrote it for me even though I had not been born yet. He wrote it for you, Miss Holloway, even though he could not have known your name.
I held the satchel against my chest the way she had held it. "I would like to come with you to Concord," she said. "When you go, I would like to give my own statement. I would like to sit in a room with a court reporter and say my grandfather's name and my father's name out loud and tell what was done to them in my own voice for the record. I am 78 years old, Miss Holloway. I have been carrying this for 47 of those years. I would like to set it down." I drove Verna Trask down to Concord the following Tuesday. We sat in the same room I had sat in 11 days earlier. The same court reporter typed. Annette Forsyth sat across the table from her and listened with the same patient, unwavering attention she had given to me. Verna Trask spoke for 4 hours without notes. When she was finished, she took her glasses off, set them on the table, and said, "I am glad I lived long enough to do that." The case moved quickly after that. The two journals together, written 60 miles and 1 generation apart, told the same story in different voices, and that congruence Annette Forsyth told me later was what no defense attorney in the country could explain away. The signed affidavits in my great-grandfather's strongbox were the legal spine. The journals were the heart. The deed of 1922 was the throat the case spoke through, and Aunt Beatrice's voicemail recording of Davis Vance, in which he laughed about burying things, was the door through which the federal investigators walked. Maxwell Vance was indicted on a Tuesday in late June. Conspiracy, wire fraud, witness tampering, 8 counts. He surrendered through his attorney at the federal courthouse in Concord without speaking to a single reporter. Davis Vance was indicted the same day on additional charges, including unlawful entry of a dwelling and intimidation of a witness. The man who had come down the cellar steps was a former employee of a private security firm Vance Mountain Holdings had retained for years. He was indicted as well. He pled in exchange for testimony 6 weeks later. Construction on the Vance Mountain Resort halted on the day the indictments came down. The deed of 1922 was admitted into evidence in the civil action that followed. The court ruled 11 months later that the contracts of 1932 had transferred to Vance Lumber Company, a title that the 7 farmers had never legally held, and that the underlying freehold title had been continuously held by the Holloway family for 103 years. 340 acres of high meadow and timberland along the eastern slope of Hemlock Ridge reverted to the Holloway estate. I gave it away. Not all of it. I kept the 11 acres immediately surrounding the farmhouse because the farmhouse was Thaddeus's and it was mine. The other 340 acres I divided into 7 roughly equal parcels and conveyed by recorded deed to the surviving descendants of the 7 families. Verna Trask received the largest piece, the eastern slope, where her grandfather had run his small dairy herd in the years before the men came to his barn. The other 6 families I located with the help of Annette Forsyth's office and with the help of a genealogist Hollister found in Concord. Some of them were still in Coos County. Some of them were in Vermont, in Maine, in Pennsylvania, in one case in Oregon. Each of them received their grandfather's land back. Each of them received a copy of the relevant page of Thaddeus Holloway's journal. Each of them received, if they wanted it, a copy of the relevant page of Eldred Trask's journal, too.
I did not keep any of the resort development settlement either. Vance Mountain Holdings under new management. Following Maxwell Vance's incarceration, paid a substantial sum to extinguish their claim against the lodge and the access road they had already built. That settlement went entirely into a trust administered through Lenora Whitlock's office. The trust funded property tax relief for long-term Coos County residents facing financial hardship. Hollister Crane,
when I told him about the trust, looked at me for a long, quiet moment and then said, "Your great-grandfather rebuilt my grandfather's stone wall in 1931 and would not take $1. That is exactly the kind of thing he would have done." Harold Pell, the numismatist in Manchester, who certified Thaddeus's gold collection over the course of 11 weeks the following autumn, told me in the dry, careful voice of a man who had been doing this work for 30 years that the coins represented a numismatic event of national significance, and that the appraised value was somewhere between $2.2 and $2.5 million, depending on final grades. The war bonds and pre-war silver certificates added another $440,000. The collection went in the spring of the following year on permanent loan to the New Hampshire Historical Society in Concord, where it is displayed in a case under museum glass with a small placard that reads, in part, "Preserved by Thaddeus Hayes, Holloway Coos, County sealed 1934, recovered 2026. I paid off my student loans on a Thursday morning in September. I closed the laptop and sat at the kitchen table at the farmhouse and listened to the creek run and to a single crow call once across the clearing and go quiet. Dorel called me that afternoon, and we cried for a long time on the phone, and neither of us said anything that made sense for the first 5 minutes. I told her to quit the wine bar. She told me she already had. The restoration of the farmhouse took 2 full summers. Eldon Markham repointed the exterior stonework 1 course at a time, matching the original mortar as closely as the county would yield. We rebuilt the chimney from the point where it had begun to lean. We replaced the roof with cedar shakes over timbers that Eldon declared sound for another century. We put in water and heat and electrical in ways the county building office approved, and that Thaddeus for suspected would have viewed with appreciation and mild contempt in roughly equal measure. I kept the cellar door. I had thought about what to do with it for a long time. I could have relayed the 4 flags over the empty cellar and let the kitchen go back to being a kitchen. I could have removed the door entirely and put in a proper hatch with the new frame. Instead, I left it as it was. The iron brackets, the old oak door with its 3 iron bands, the 5 stone steps leading down into a space that now holds clean shelving, and a chest freezer and cases of preserves I put up each fall from the small orchard Eldon helped me plant on the southern slope. The mortar seal is gone. The padlocks are open, hanging on their hasps. The door swings freely on hinges Eldon cleaned and oiled until they moved without sound. It is the first thing people notice when they come into the kitchen. They stop and they look at it and they ask. And I tell them.
I tell them about Thaddeus, who built the house and sealed the floor and wrote a letter to someone he never met. About Royce, who was weak in the way that people can be weak without being entirely lost, and who paid for that weakness with 60 years of silence from his own father. About my grandfather, who held the title for decades without knowing what to do with the weight of it. About my father, who drove up here one afternoon in 2008 and stood in this kitchen with the key in his hand and understood in his honest, private way that he was not the right person to open it. Who spent the next 18 years paying the taxes and keeping the key safe, and finally left it where I would find it, with 4 words that were the most he ever managed to say about what he believed about me.
For Marin, when ready.
I think about those words often. I think about the particular courage it takes to admit that you are not ready, and the particular faith it takes to believe that someone else will be. My father was not a man who expressed himself easily. He was not a man who found the language for love in any conventional sense. But he found a way. He found a key and a false bottom, and a folded piece of paper, and a careful letter left in trust with a man in a hardware store 6 miles down a county road.
And that was the vocabulary he had, and he used it.
Aunt Beatrice and I are not close. We will not ever be close. But we speak now 2 or 3 times a year, and the speaking is honest in a way it never was before. She returned the $30,000. She sold the small house in Lowell and moved to a smaller apartment and lives, she tells me, more quietly than she ever has. Holden, she tells me, no longer takes her calls. I do not know what passed between them after the federal investigators interviewed him as a witness. I have not asked.
Hollister Crane closed the hardware store the year after the indictments. He retired at 76. He still drives out to the farmhouse every Saturday morning. He brings coffee from Pell's. We sit on the granite step in any weather, and he tells me stories about his father that he had been carrying for 70 years and had not been able to set down. I tell him stories about my father that I am only now learning how to find. We do not always say much.
There are mornings in late autumn when neither of us says anything at all for an hour, and the creek runs, and the maples drop their last red leaves onto the lane, and the silence between us is the most companionable silence I have known. Verna Trask died last spring at 89. She left her grandfather's journal to the New Hampshire Historical Society, where it sits now in the same case as the St. Gaudens coins, sealed behind the same museum glass. The placard on Eldred Trask's journal reads, "Kept by Eldred Trask, Coos County, 1929 to 1956. Kept after him by his son, by his daughter, and by his granddaughter, Verna, who in 2026 placed it into the hands of a young woman she had been waiting 47 years to meet."
She wanted the placard to say that. I made sure it did. I am 30 years old now. The farmhouse has been my primary home for 8 years. I work by way of a small consulting practice I built slowly over the first 3 of those years with families across northern New England who are trying to recover land taken from their forebears under duress in the early 20th century. There are more such families than I would have believed when I first sat in Annette Forsyth's office. There are not enough resources to help them all. But there are some. And I help where I can, and on the days when the work is hard, or the records are missing, or the descendants cannot be located, I drive out to the upper meadow above the farmhouse, and I stand in the long grass, and I listen to the wind move in the maples, and I remember why I keep doing it. The skeleton key sits on the kitchen windowsill, not hung on a hook, not locked in a drawer. On the sill, where the morning light comes through the deep stone window and finds it. It does not look like much. Old brass tarnished to the color of dried blood, the leather cord stiff with 94 years of waiting. Most things that matter do not look like much. But every morning, when the light comes through that window and catches it, I know exactly what it is. It is the most direct thing my father ever said to me. It is 4 generations of a family doing the best they could with what they had, which sometimes was nothing. And sometimes was more than they knew. It is a door that waited in the dark for 92 years for the right hands to open it. It is 7 farms returned to 7 families. It is the long quiet of a man named Wendell Crane, who fell into a gorge in June of 1955 with no fishing rod and no creel finally allowed to rest. It is the long quiet of my father, who carried a weight he could not lift and who trusted me with the lifting. And it is mine.